We hit the water with our wheels down, immediately turned us upside down. The other four of the crew were thrown out through the nose of the airplane. I was in the back. I was knocked unconscious for a while. The bombardier must have gone out through the nose of the airplane because the imprint of the plexiglass nose was sort of imprinted on the top of his head, and he was bleeding profusely.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade
to meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I was interested in aviation. I was ever since I'd seen an airplane. And I joined the Army Air Corps because I knew that's where I wanted to be. And signed up in Billings on December the 2nd, 1940, came to Fort Missoula and was sworn in here on the 3rd, a year and 4 days before Pearl Harbor. The 95th Bomb Squadron, the 17th Bomb Group, was the first group in the Army Air Corps to begin training in B-25s. They had more experience, so all of the raiders were picked out of that bomb group. They needed volunteers for a special mission. I was a mechanic on the ground, and I wanted to do some flying, so I was able to get on that crew.
What was your first impression of Jimmy Doolittle?
He was one of the shortest guys on the raid. He was very intelligent. He knew what he was doing. He not only knew how to fly, but he also knew everything about the airplanes that we were flying.
What was training at Eglin like?
Very intense. We did very intensive training so they could be prepared to take off an aircraft carrier in that very short distance. Life on the carrier was quite interesting. We were on there. We left San Francisco the 2nd of April 1942, and in a small task force with the Enterprise, the air carrier we were on, and then they had 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers and a tanker in that small convoy. And then about the 13th of April, we met up with another task force. It had the carrier Enterprise with it, also the same number of ships. So there's 16 ships in the task force then. The 18th of April, run into a Japanese picket ship out there, and we were afraid that they had radioed to Japan that there was a task force out there. So we had to take off immediately. And we found out later that the Japanese picket ship, before it was sunk, had radioed to Japan that there was a task force there. But the Japanese knew there was no U.S. aircraft off a carrier could fly that far and return to the carrier. So they weren't prepared for us. They took all the weight off the airplane we possibly could. The bottom turret was removed because we would be flying so low that no enemy fighter could get underneath of us. And they put a 60-gallon tank in where that bottom turret was. Above the, in the bomb bay, in the top of the bomb bay, they also put a tank that held over 100 gallons of gasoline, and we still had room for 4 500-pound bombs. There's a crawlway between the top of the bomb bay and the top of the airplane, just enough room to crawl through there. They put a collapsible rubber tank in there, held way over 100 gallons, and they used the gasoline out of there after we left Japan, and it was when they transferred all the gasoline out of that tank, then I was able to roll that tank to one side, so then I could crawl through there to get up to the front of the airplane. Before I got up in the airplane, they handed me a dozen 5-gallon cans of gasoline, so that they used the gasoline out of the turret tank first, and then I was able to dump those cans of gasoline into the turret tank and used the crash axe to cut a hole in each end of those empty cans, threw them out the window. I did that so they would sink immediately instead of leaving a trail from where we'd come. When we took off, it was very rough weather, but when we reached Japan, the weather cleared up, sun was shining, and just a beautiful day. It was Saturday, right about noon, and there were quite a few people on the beach, and as we went overhead, they were waving to us. We were flying so low I could see the expressions on their faces. They were cheering, but we were over their heads and gone before they could see the Army Air Corps insignia on the bottom of the right wing and on both sides of the airplane. Of course, we were flying about 50 feet off the ground. That's what altitude we came in over the ocean, too. So I had to come to a hill or something. I had to go up over that and then over trees. So we had to back down as close to the ground as we could get. Between the coast then and before we reached Tokyo, formation of 6 airplanes met us, but they were flying so low they didn't. I'm sure they didn't see us. They just kept on going the direction they were going. That's the only other enemy plane that we saw. As we approached Tokyo, then we had to climb to 1,500 feet so that when our bombs went off, they wouldn't blow us out of the air. And there was quite a bit of anti-aircraft fire over the city when we reached there, but it wasn't accurate. Our target was this Nippon Steel factory in Tokyo. We dropped there 4 bombs on that, and then headed for Tokyo Bay and got out of there as soon as we could. And then we followed the coast of Japan, not over land, but over the ocean, all the way to the southern tip of Japan, and then turned west to China.
If you're enjoying this video, you should join our exclusive Patreon community to receive early access to videos each week, the chance to send questions to our heroes, and much more. We scour the country to identify, film, share, and preserve these first-hand battlefield accounts, and time is of the essence. To join our mission, visit patreon.com/American Veterans Center or click the link in our description. It's up to each of us to guard their legacy and honor their sacrifice. Thanks, and now back to the interview.
Well, it was nearly dark and raining, and the pilot spotted a strip of beach he thought he could set the airplane down on, but I don't know if he'd misjudged it. I think he misjudged the distance because it was pretty dark. And so we hit the water with our wheels down, immediately turned us upside down. The other 4 of the crew were thrown out through the nose of the airplane. I was in the back. I was knocked unconscious for a while. Finally realized that there was water coming in to what I thought was the bottom of the airplane. So I tried to get out there, but then realized it was upside down and the plexiglass on the turret had shattered, so that's where water was coming in. So I was able to work my back to the bottom escape hatch and open that and get out on the bottom of the airplane. And I stepped off the tail of the airplane, then it was, water was about waist deep. By that time, the other 4 of the crew had gotten up onto the beach. The first thing we saw was a few people up on the bank there, and they must have heard the crash because they come down from a couple of buildings there. And they finally come down to where we were. And the first thing they wanted to know, we couldn't understand them and they couldn't understand us, but they pointed to their hand and pointed to one finger and then pointed to one of us, and then after 5, then we figured they wanted to know if there was any more of us in the airplane. We convinced them there was just the 5 of us. So they tried to help us to get up on the bank and away from the airplane. So we stayed there overnight, and the pilot had a deep gash in his leg and a gash in his arm, and the co-pilot had a deep gash in his left arm. The navigator was kneeling between the pilot and co-pilot's armor-plated seats when he went out. The bombardier must have gone out through the nose of the airplane because the imprint of the bracing on the plexiglass nose was sort of imprinted on the top of his head, and he was bleeding profusely. They got us up to there, and I was the only one that got out of the plane with a pistol belt on. I had one large bandage in my first aid kit, and I used that to try to close the cut on a pilot's leg. And then we had to use probably handkerchiefs and I don't know what else, maybe undershirts to try and bind up the gashes on the other people's heads. I went out to the airplane about sometime about 3 o'clock in the morning probably, with a lantern and a couple of Chinese, and tried to get to the airplane, but the tide had come in, so I couldn't get to it then. Then at daylight it went out again, and it was high and dry. Both engines with propellers still attached were quite a ways from the airplane. Then I could see how much damage was done to the airplane. The whole front of the airplane with a pilot's compartment and a navigator and bombardier's compartment were smashed flat back against the leading edge of the wing. So if they hadn't been thrown out, they'd have never got out alive. I went back to where the others were, the other fellows were, about 11 o'clock, and the guerrilla leader on the island there had fixed up some stretchers, some pallets, so they could carry them. The other four, because they couldn't walk then. And we left there at 11 o'clock that morning, and we found out later, about 3 o'clock, there were a company of Japanese soldiers landed right on that spot and came looking for us. But we'd already started across the island, so they never caught up to us. It took us most of the night and most of the next day to get across that island. It was a pretty good-sized island. And then the evening of the second day, we finally reached free territory in China, a small city there on the coast, Haiyu. And there we were met by a Chinese doctor that had come from a city of Linhai that day to help us. So then that was the first medical attention we'd had for 2 days. By that time, gangrene had set in the pilot's leg, so he eventually had to have it amputated at that hospital in China. The third day, then, we had to travel 25 miles to get to that hospital, but just walking and being carried. And the Chinese had blown up all the roads along the coast to slow the advance of the Japanese, so there were just trails through the rice paddies to get there. We were there 3 days, and a crew number 15 had made a good water landing on an island, near an island, out farther from the coast than we were. And the guerrillas were operating on that island too. So they brought them to the island that we were on, and our co-pilot, Dean Davenport, had given his passport to the guerrilla leader on the island. So they knew we were ahead of them and needed medical help. They had the only doctor that was on the raid on that crew. He took training as a gunner so he could go on a crew. The plane floated for 8 minutes. They were able to get the life raft out and get all their equipment in the life raft. But in landing, a sharp edge of one of the flaps turned up, and as they pushed the life raft off the wing of the plane, that turned up flap snagged the raft and dumped everything in the water, deflated half the raft. So they were able to cling to the raft until they got to shore. And we were there another 3 days, and Doc White he stayed with my crew, and I went on with the other 4 of crew number 15. Worked our way inland. It took us, we traveled by sedan, sharing every mode of transportation you could think of. Most of the time walking for day after day. Finally got to where we were able to ride in a rickshaw all one morning. Then I got to the place, then looked across the draw there, and there was the automobiles waiting for us. Finally got the city of Hanyang. It's a huge city on the Yangtze River. And there, an airplane was supposed to come in from Chongqing to pick us up. For 3 days in a row, the air raid siren went off when we were eating breakfast. So we walked down to the dock, got on a tug, went up the river a few miles, and the canyons and the rivers are got a very steep bank. So he just pulled up to the bank and let us out and went up to. There was about a 6-story pagoda on top of a hill there, and so we went up there and looked through that, and they were making storage batteries in the basement of it. The 4th morning, the airplane came in from Chongqing to pick us up. Well, that day, the Japanese came over and bombed and strafed that pagoda. They had spies through there. They knew what we had been doing. We finally reached Chongqing a month after the crash. So there, Madame Chiang Kai-shek had a banquet for us. We met the Generalissimo. He could not speak English or understand it, but she could, because she went to school here in the United States. Then we flew from there. We were there about 3 days in Chongqing, and then flew to Kunming to refuel, and that's where the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, was stationed. And flew over the hump to Calcutta. It was during the dry season, and hazy and dusty, and we overshot Calcutta and landed in a big plowed field. And Indians coming from all directions ran out there, the natives, to see what was the matter. So we finally talked to one old man. He said, told us where Calcutta was, which direction. So we took off and then landed at the airport at Calcutta. And I was there for 10 days and waiting for orders. I was there the last 10 days of May of '42. And then went to New Delhi by train, and then to Karachi flew there. And there I received my orders to come back to the United States. So we came on around the world from there. From Karachi we flew to Basra, Iraq the first night, and then Cairo the next night. And France had surrendered by then, so all of Northwest Africa was under German control. So we had to fly south to Khartoum in the Sudan, then southwest across Africa to Liberia, to Nigeria first, and then Liberia, and then across the South Atlantic in a Pan-American clipper. Took 12 hours to fly to Brazil and South America, and then flew from there north to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Miami.
So tell me, what happened after you got back to the United States, and then how many,
Went home to Billings for a couple of weeks furlough, and then reported to McDill Field to Tampa, Florida, and began training in B-26s. It's also a medium bomber, twin engine, but it's got a single tail, that's a double tail like a B-25. Trained down there for until about 1st October, then went to New York by train and then boarded the Queen Mary and went to Scotland. And the Queen Mary went across the North Atlantic alone. It had changed course every 3 miles, turned 90 degrees, zigzagging across the North Atlantic. A submarine couldn't wait for it, and it couldn't catch up to it. Off the coast of Ireland, a dozen U.S. and British destroyers met us to escort us into Glasgow, Scotland. One destroyer cut across the front of the Queen Mary twice looking for submarines. The third time it didn't make it, the Queen Mary cut it in two. That accident was not reported to the public until after World War II was over. So we disembarked at Glasgow and then went down to Norwich, England, which is east of London. We didn't have our airplanes there, so every night the German bombers would come over our base on their way to London, but they didn't bother us. Then I was in the hospital for 2 weeks with malaria in a civilian hospital over there. In the meantime, my outfit had moved out on their way to North Africa, and I was attached to an engineer outfit and went by convoy then to North Africa. Landed there about the 1st of January of '43, and we were, until April of '43, we were flying submarine patrol back and forth across the Mediterranean from Iran, Algeria to the coast of Spain. Moved up to the front in April, and we were bombing the Italians and Germans out of North Africa, and we could reach the islands of Sicily and Sardinia in the Mediterranean and the southern half of Italy. And by July, the Allies had captured Sicily. So then we moved up to Tunisia, and from there we could first bombing Sicily and Sardinia, and then after they, through invading Sicily, they had already captured that. So we were bombing southern Italy. I was on 26 bombing missions over there, and including the first one on Rome. And then I got what they call yellow jaundice in about last of September, which is hepatitis. And then I was in the hospital for 2.5 months there, and I didn't do any more flying after that. Finally came back to the United States in January of '44. And the rest of the war I was in Station, California, until July '45 when I was discharged.
When did you fully understand the impact that the Doolittle Raid had for America, what you guys did?
The public was not informed very much about the raid until 1 year afterwards, so it was top secret then. After the war, we had reunions all except for 2 years, ever since 1945. So it was great to see the other raiders through the years, see how they were doing, keep track of them.
Do you think you're a hero?
No. No.